Welcome to my video on the US Civil Rights Movement. Today I'll be talking about the struggles that colored people went through in the past and how things have changed. I'll be focusing on the Freedom Riders along with other events that happened during these times. From the beginning of the USA, colored slavery has been a serious problem and was for many centuries. The starting point of slavery in America was in the year 1619, when the privateer the White Lion brought 20 enslaved Africans to the shore of a British colony in Jamestown, Virginia. The African people had been seized from a Portuguese slave ship known by São João Batista. Further along, in the 17th and 18th centuries, people were kidnapped from Africa and brought to America, where they were forced into slavery. These people were used to work as servants and hard labor jobs such as the production of crops like tobacco and cotton. Slavery continued as more and more European settlers in North America turned to enslaved Africans as a cheap option instead of employing their own people. Although it is impossible to know exactly, it is estimated that 6 to 7 million people were taken from Africa enslaved in the New World during the 18th century alone. Through these actions, Africa was left deprived of some of their healthiest and ablest men and women. Although not often successful, rebellions from enslaved people did occur. One rebellion that terrified enslavers was led by Nat Turner in Southampton County, Virginia, in August of 1831. Turner's group, which in total was around 75 black men, revolted and murdered 55 white people in 2 days before armed resistance of white men overwhelmed and condemned them. Nat Turner's actions destroyed the white Southern myth that enslaved people were actually happy with their lives and too disciplined to undertake a violent rebellion. Some supporters of slavery at the time took Turner's rebellion as a form of evidence that black people were just inhumane barbarians that needed something such as slavery to discipline them. These beliefs and fears of similar events occurring led to many of the southern states to further strengthen their slave codes to limit education, movement, and assembly of enslaved people. The Freedom Riders were a group of 13 white and colored American men and women who acted through nonviolent protests to test a 1960 decision by the Supreme Court that segregation of interstate transportation facilities, including bus terminal, was unconstitutional. The Freedom Riders were 13 white and colored American men and women led by James Farmer. The youngest of the group, Charles Person from Atlanta, was only 18 at the time of the first ride. These protests were organized and run by CAUSE, the Congress of Racial Equality, National Director James Farmer. The Freedom Riders stood for the rights of colored people, their standing in society, and how they were treated and how it was wrong. The main thing they stood for and protested for was the erasing of segregation, specifically in bus terminals and on buses. Furthermore, they stood for and were a symbol for the abolishment of all racism and inequality in society, and were standing up to show that you don't need violence to fight and show people that it was a serious issue and it needed to be stopped. The Freedom Rides stemmed from the Journey of Reconciliation, which was an early version of the Freedom Rides started by the Corps and organized by Bayard Rustin and 18 other men and women in 1947. This journey was a 2-week stand that challenged the state segregation law on interstate buses in the South of America. Although this movement was only slightly successful, it was what influenced the beginning of the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Riders acted on their beliefs because at the time, these acts of segregation were happening to so many people around America. But it was so hard to make a change and stand up for your rights as a human, so when they had this idea, they just knew it was going to work. So they took act and stood up against the terrible laws of the time to try and gain the equality that society needed. The local and state police in the South considered the actions of the Freedom Riders to be criminal and placed the participants under arrest in some locations. In some places, such as Birmingham and Alabama, the police were in coup with the Ku Klux Klan and other groups of white people who were against the actions of the Freedom Riders, and even let groups of these people attack and mob the riders. On May 14, 1961, on the 10th day of the ride, the bus entered Anniston, Alabama, which at the time was home to the largest Ku Klux Klan organization in America. In Anniston, a group were waiting for the riders. The group slashed the bus's tires, had tried to drive away, and escape, but due to the damage, they were unsuccessful, and only a few miles out of the town, the group caught up to them. The group then went on to fireball the bus with all the riders still on board. They tried to escape but were met with people blocking the exits to try and keep them inside the burning bus. After some time, the fuel tank exploded, scaring away some of the group, giving the Freedom Riders a chance to escape the burning bus. But as they did, they were met by the remaining of the group, who attacked and beat them. Eventually, after little help prior, the police started to disperse the attackers, but the riders received very minimal medical care, something they were all in need of. Luckily, soon after all this, Birmingham civil rights leader Fred Shuttlesworth organized a convoy to evacuate all the riders out of Anniston. The effects of the Freedom Riders was huge, with them first achieving their goal to remove segregation on interstate buses, along with making a huge impact on the issues of racism and inequality of the time. Through their non-violent protest being a success, they did not only achieve their goal, but by doing what they did, both educated and shed light from a different angle on the issues of the time. This then led to people being inspired, enlightened, and wanting to make a change themselves. Even today, the work of the Freedom Riders still inspires people who are going through the same things and experiencing the wrongs of racism in today's day of society, to stand up for the wrongful power and make a change. So even though they did not directly end segregation and a large portion of other racism and inequality, they were the spark and influence that started so many other fights and revolts against the wrong higher power to claim the rights and lives that they deserved. The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, passed on July 9, 1868, was a law that granted citizenships to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former enslaved people, and guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the law. This was one of 3 amendments passed during the Reconstruction era to abolish slavery and establish civil and legal rights for Black Americans. Jim Crow was the name given to the racial system that primarily but not only operated in the southern and bordering states of America between 1877 and the mid-1960s. The name Jim Crow came from a minstrel routine that was performed by Thomas Dartmouth Rice in the early times of 1828. From this, the term became a derogatory name for African Americans and a description for their segregated life. Jim Crow was both a rigid series of anti-black laws and a way of life for colored Americans. Under Jim Crow, African Americans were relegated to the status of a second-class citizen. Jim Crow was there to validate and condone anti-black racism. These laws affected almost every part of daily life, mandating segregated parks, drinking fountains, schools, buses, parks, libraries, restrooms, trains, and restaurants. The use of white-only and colored signs was a continuous reminder of the enforced racial order. According to the laws of the time, the colored people received separate but equal treatment. But in all seriousness, the public facilities for blacks were nowhere near equal and were almost always second class to those of the white people. On top of this, the colored people of the time were denied the right to vote. Martin Luther King Jr., born on January 15, 1929, was an American Baptist minister and activist who made himself a name through becoming one of the most visible and well-known spokespersons and leaders in the 1955 American Civil Rights Movement. King both was part of and led marches and rallies for blacks' rights, like the right to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and other basic civil rights they deserved. On August 28, 1963, during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, King delivered his historic speech, "I Have a Dream," in front of some 250,000 people. He used links and references to the country's founding fathers and to the Bible. He used worldwide themes to show and explain the struggles of African Americans had endured and gone through. He then ended the speech with an improvised idea of his ideal and dreams of equality for all people. Later, on April 4, 1968, King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, after giving a speech the night before at a sanitation workers' strike. The day after his speech, he was shot and killed by a sniper while standing on the balcony that him and his associates were staying at. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Provisions of this Civil Rights Act forbade discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race in hiring, promoting, and firing of jobs. The Act prohibited discrimination in public accommodations, federally funded programs. It also strengthened the enforcement of voting rights and the desegregation of schools. Unfortunately, even today, racism is still in our lives, and people of color still must fight unnecessary and wrong battles to live the same way the rest of society does. But that does not mean that all the fighting the freedom riders and people of the past did was for nothing. Their first fights against the wrong is what started the never-ending battle for equality in all forms in today's society. People are still, in this modern world, influenced and empowered by the past actions and battles that happened, and use this to find the power in themselves to make a change and a difference in the world. The past actions and events also show that change can happen. It may not be quick and easy, but with persistence and the right approach, as an individual or as a whole, we can achieve a goal, in this case equality, a much strived for and needed goal in today's society. Thank you for watching and listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed and learned about the civil rights movement, and you now know more about the struggles colored people have had to go through and the fights and battles that they have endured.